Hello. Continued. Sorry. Continued YouTube on explaining urbanism and digital narratives after COVID. The class at Stony Brook in the Globalization Department. We are reading Dream Cities. Progressing through this book, which is a good compendium, a survey on types of cities, and cities that have formed usually from the late 19th century to the beginning of the 21st century. I've chosen this book to give you an outline of basic forms of the class, basic forms of urban planning, and to achieve an idea of how these cities developed out of function, a response to function, amassing these economic spaces to which 60% of the global population live in these cities for greater condensation of use value, exchange value, jobs, principally driven by that dichotomy between use value and exchange value. And we can see these cities and the authors of urbanism and architecture, how they wish to form the impression of the cities and the environments we live in. The important part for urbanism after COVID is to see how our general directive of a catastrophic city, the city as it wakes up from COVID, and a general lockdown throughout the world, interconnected cities in personal face-to-face spaces, has affected even these 7 models. So let's begin with the models. What Wade Graham covers is types of modalities as they are developed aesthetically, but also usefully. We don't want to live just anywhere. We want to have some sort of emotion and pride of place. And often that's tough to do. I live in New York City. I live in Brooklyn. I live in a corner of Brooklyn, Windsor Terrace, between a very famous park and a very famous cemetery. This is often very resemblant of a suburb, a New York City suburb, which I personally do not like for various reasons covered in this book. But it has a proximity by subway of 20 minutes to downtown New York. Within this notion, let us maintain also this notion of a cosmopolitan space, a space we want to live in for curiosity, proximity to ideas, proximity to opposing ideas, and everything that the cosmopolitan city was supposed to engender, in addition to having a labor force, conduct large masses of people within this industrial revolution. And again, we're framing this in terms of the background of disaster or black swans that can happen out of nowhere and change their lives, such as COVID-19, but also with this notion that we are running out of 500 million years of stored solar energy. Again, it takes 10 calories of petroleum to bring in 1 calorie of food, and this is untenable within the year 2040, 2050. We've hit post-peak oil by 2010. The economic ascendancy of America was practically extinguished or had its crescent at 1973, most notably at the end of the Vietnam War. And in that, the GDP, general American GDP, which spent upward up to 1/4 to 1/3 of the international natural resources, is now in a rethinking position. Ascendant countries such as China, Japan earlier, a couple of European Union are also in this predicament, thinking of how best to conserve their natural resources, specifically in the form of oil production. In a attendant paper, the Architects Anonymous call these cities alpha cities. So let's see the structure of these alpha cities. First of all, we have castles. From Bertram Goodhue and the Romantic City. The Romantic City often makes a return visit, because who doesn't like visiting excuse me, who doesn't like visiting Disneyland, Venice, and other European cities that have been preserved? We see sort of a romantic response. There was a romantic response in America at the turn of the cities to recreate these wonderful sort of romantic buildings that had little to do in response to modernity. Many of the college campuses, such as Yale, Princeton, parts of Harvard, resemble this romantic response to engender a feeling or atmosphere of a sequestered city. What Wade Graham covers in this book are where these cities actually happened in America. Second is monuments. Daniel Burnham and the Ordered City is a response to the Romantic City, which also had its roots in a kind of a leftist arts and crafts movement from England and Northern Europe, and actually America, out of the utopian communities. There was a response to the increased industrialization of cities, the horrid conditions, the overcrowding, the air pollution, the cholera, things like that. So the Romantic City was an aesthetic response to the horrific sense of the late 19th century industrial city. Was that a band-aid? Was that a mere facade? Could have been. The monumental city was a counter-response to that, and said that principally through Chicago and a couple of cities in the Midwest, we need a city of memory. We need a city devoted to monuments, mostly war monuments, but there also needs to be a sense of rationality, the gridded city. There was a nostalgia for Roman base camps and the gridding of the cities. New York City, Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn clearly responded to it at Prospect Park with its Grand Army Plaza up at the top with a triumphal arch, very Roman in style. That was a movement to respond to the need to make each city the penultimate art work of humanity. The city is a work of art, but it should be ordered. Next, slabs. Swiss architect Le Corbusier, our own New York Robert Mositz, which he bisected a area of an Irish ghetto over here of cops and firemen way back in the 40s, 50s to create Fort Hamilton Parkway, essentially destroying and punishing the community by the creation of these parkways developed for inventions such as the automobile. And with this, we do get a sense that this was a beginning of the problem of exploiting this newly developed internal combustion engine and the automobile as the main source of detached room to get you around these fantastic cities, usually romantic cities, ordered cities. And this is the birth of the slab, which was to say that apart from a romantic response to tidy up industrial cities and to have the upper bourgeois or middle class, upper middle class not look at certain ugly sections of each of these large, mostly European cities: Paris, London, Berlin, Budapest, New York. That we needed another modernist response other than merely to create these Disneylands out of architectural orders that had been long dead in the Romantic response. These rational cities, these slab cities, did exactly that: create large slabs that intersected, happened. In the Voisin plan of Paris, there was an intention by Le Corbusier to level whole old chunks of medieval town to put up these slabs, in which thousands of people would live. This is certainly there's certainly exciting modernist ideas in this, but there are also extremely effete and paternalistic ideas on how the workers should live, how to cleanse a worker of their grubbiness coming from agrarian country into the factory city, how we order the space. This comes out of the Bauhaus tradition of rationality. This was a response to World War I, which they felt was an antiquated imperialistic war with industrial means, mass-produced slaughter on the trenches with the Maxim machine gun. And what Le Corbusier, Robert Moses, the Bauhausians such as Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, wanted to provide the city with right angles. That some of their feeling was that the elite ordered one percenters, as you wish, which was more than 1% at that time, could paternalistically provide the populace with ordered living. And so thus we have these giant housing complexes with the essentially slabs in the park. And the idea is that people live in these little hamster hutches, and they play in these open park areas. I think the percentage is 20 to 30% park would be created around this high density living of 80%, mostly created through stacked living, up to 14, 15, 18 stories tall. If you look around New York, there are still Stuyvesant Village housing projects in Brooklyn. This idea of the slab was rampant in both capitalist countries, free market capitalist countries of the West, as well as Eastern European countries. This was a response to to eliminating agriculture, or the transition from singular farms to factory farms. The amount of labor that would move from the rural areas to the urban areas, they needed to live somewhere. They would live in a slab in the middle of a park. Humane or inhumane? I saw the Le Corbusier show at MoMA 3-4 years ago. Fascinating drawings, fascinating paintings, fascinating ideas, fascinating top-down elitist look at how human beings should live. I've been to the Bauhaus in Germany. I'm a big fan of modernist buildings, but is it practical according to human nature to live in these spaces? The verdict is out. I've also lived in intense multiple housing units in Seoul, Singapore, to which they've employed this idea of the slab as a continued concept. These are realities, and these are things we respond to. This could be part of the problem, as I said, because much of the getting around in these slab cities, even slabs out in the middle of the country, in some ideas, the utopian dwellings of Frank Lloyd Wright, Usonian City, certain Eastern European cities, and certainly in the suburbs of most Asian cities, megacities, often look like fortified medieval walls because they're totally rimmed by these dense housing areas, which are almost devoid of the American style detached house, um, um, bourgeois propriety devoted to the returning soldier after World War II. That these housing areas are gigantic, multi storied, tens of thousands of people. Perhaps different cultures respond and live in these very differently according to their spatial habits. Many of these houses, as housing works, as developed by Robert Moses, a very autocratic individual, famously portrayed in movies, and Motherless Brooklyn actually has a portrayal, a character in it resembling Robert Moses. Um, very autocratic ideal of how human beings should live in a city as tempered by the dominant economy, which is industrial economy. Now we live in a post-industrial economy. We see the large industrial cities of China taking the idea of the slab city and running with it, making it the predominant housing form. I was in Beijing in 2002, looked down on a Christmas day. There were all these snowy little hutans or detached sort of one-story houses. And returning in 2010, 12, a lot of them were gone, replaced by slabs. Let's go on. Homesteads. Frank Lloyd Wright, a very particular American response to the earlier version of Slabs. Frank Lloyd Wright, very particular individual from a utopian tradition of Spring Green in Wisconsin, very Midwestern, I contend. Extremely influenced by the arts and crafts movement, a type of Fabian socialism that the individual bootstraps themselves up from a notion of the products of their own hand. Creativity was a big impetus. In a sense, Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to create houses in which everybody could be an architect. That when you're in ordered aesthetic space, there's a type of mental hygiene that comes over you, the idea of creating things from your hands, you against nature, forming culture, is a very utopian Midwestern project. And with this, he came out of a tradition of individual houses, very affordably priced, designed by, in the sense of the slab cities, Le Corbusier, a elitist sort of response to how people should live, very didactic. Once you lived in one of his houses as a patron, or lived in one of his Usonian plans, Oak Park in Chicago is for the upper middle class. Even back then, he had largely wealthy patrons because architecture is a business, after all, placed within markets. The notion of homestead coming out of a largely agrarian America, which most of China went through in the 90s, into an idea of how should we live? How should we live not in big, ugly slabs like hamsters, but how should we develop our own aesthetics, whether in a detached house or in larger dwelling space? If you look at his Broadacre city, it's evenly distributed and often seems contrary to human nature itself. Human nature, will see the other city types, wishes to coagulate and form these ant heaps and have intuitive vectors to how to get to places, factories for working, agriculture, which is now shipped in by rail or airplane or truck. And these response of the homestead, as Wade Graham has said, was largely a response that keyed people into a notion of the suburban home, the detached home, that we, the product of the French Revolution, as a combination of Rousseau, The Rights of Free Men, and Immanuel Kant, every individual is an entity unto themselves, that we forge this Anglo-American Puritan aspect of individuality to which all people arriving in America got to a certain degree and understood principally spatially, that we arrived to this notion of the homestead as the precursor to the suburban house. If you've ever been to Oak Park in Chicago, beautiful houses, it just hits you in terms of the wonderful aesthetics, but the predominant feeling you get is like each house is a castle to this particleized individuality that is pejoratively called nowadays snowflake individuality, that everyone's a unique snowflake and therefore you have to have your house, your space to reflect that. Note that this was a pre-war movement that bridged World War II, which, as the spoils of war, was given to the returning soldiers from the European and Japanese battlefields in the form of the GI Plan. Many children and immigrants could now study on the GI Bill, educate themselves, become the man in the gray flannel suit, and there was a contortion of more or less a agrarian ideal of husband and wife as a playful team of co-workers. The new Levittown house, which Long Island is the model, and New York suburbs, Robert Mimosas, also I contend Frank Lloyd Wright, divides this down into the nuclear family, coming out of Freud in Vienna, that imprinting should be based on gender narratives, that each person had his role. The mother would have the babies, stay at home, keep the house, the castle. The man would preferably get in his car, drive to the city, read expense, and enjoy, upon his return, the detached homestead that not only the suburban planners like Robert Moses, but also Frank Lloyd Wright, and we'll get into malls and habitats, what the proponents of the attached home as castle were talking about as the spoils of war, the fruits of modernity, the fruits of forging out your own identity, when in actuality it could be just cookie cutter realities. We'll continue with that at the end of 25 minutes.